"She has nothing to offer this family," the Dowager Duchess said at her own dinner table, in a voice pitched precisely to carry the length of it. "No connections worth the name, no fortune to speak of, and a father who kept sheep before he kept a baronetcy. I have wondered for 3 years what my son imagined he was purchasing." There were 11 guests at that table, and every one of them heard it, and Harriet Roe, Duchess of Rothbury, set down her fork without a sound and did not answer. She did not argue. She did not cry. She simply finished her soup and asked the footman quietly for the next course, and by the time the pudding came round she had already begun, in the private ledger of her own mind, to pack. Alistair Roe, 8th Duke of Rothbury, heard his mother's remark from the head of the table and felt the familiar, weary irritation of a man who had spent 31 years watching the Dowager Duchess draw blood at dinner and never once found the nerve, in the moment itself, to draw it back. He would speak to Harriet after, privately, the way he always did, a quiet apology in the corridor, a promise that his mother meant nothing by it, that things would improve. He had made that same promise, in one form or another, perhaps 40 times in 3 years of marriage. He made it again that night, at her dressing-room door, and Harriet listened to the whole of it, with the particular stillness she had perfected over 3 years of listening to apologies that changed nothing. "She has said worse before," Harriet said, when he finished. "You have said the same thing before, every time. I no longer know which of you I am meant to forgive. Harriet, good night. Alistair." He stood a moment in the corridor after the door shut and found himself thinking, unbidden, of the particular way she had set down her fork at dinner, not flung, not trembling, simply set down with the same exact steadiness she brought to closing a ledger at the end of a long quarter. He had watched her do that 100 times over 3 years, and never once, until that evening, understood it as anything other than good manners. It occurred to him now, standing alone in a dark corridor, that it was in fact the sound of a woman deciding something, and that he had no earthly notion what. He did not think, closing that door behind him, that he was hearing anything more than the ordinary weariness of an ordinary quarrel. He had no notion, that night, that his wife had already written 3 letters, to her father's steward, to her own solicitor in London, to the housekeeper at the small dower cottage her father had left her outright. The one piece of property in England that belonged to Harriet Roe and to no one else, and that all 3 would go out with the Morning Post. Rothbury Park ran, and had run for 3 years, on a foundation almost nobody at that table understood, because almost nobody had troubled to look. The narrator must go back 3 years to make sense of what was lost, because a marriage does not arrive fully formed, and this one had begun with more genuine warmth than either party allowed themselves to remember once the daily grind of Rothbury had worn it thin. Alistair had met Harriet Colston at a modest country assembly in the autumn of his father's final illness, when he had gone to Ashenden on estate business and stayed, against his own plans, for a second evening entirely on her account. She had argued with him, that first night, about the proper management of a home farm, a subject he had expected no gently bred young woman to hold an opinion on at all, let alone a correct one, and he had found himself, for the first time in years, genuinely delighted rather than merely charmed. "You disagree with everything I say," he had told her, on the second evening, half laughing. "I disagree with everything you say that is wrong, Your Grace, which I grant is a great deal, though I hold out hope for improvement." She had not lowered her eyes when she said it, and he had understood, standing in a candlelit country drawing-room with his father dying 80 miles away, that he had just met the one person in England who would tell him the truth regardless of his rank, and that he wanted, very much, to keep that near him for the whole of his life. He had married her within the year, sincerely, and for those reasons, and it was only slowly, under the accumulating weight of his father's debts and his mother's grief, fueled extravagance and his own exhausted relief at having a wife who simply handled things, that the daily warmth had worn down into something closer to comfortable inattention. He had stopped noticing her particular sharpness because it had stopped, somewhere in the second year, being aimed delightfully at him, and had turned instead quietly toward the ledgers, the accounts, the 1,000 small burdens he had never once thought to share. Alistair's father had died deep in debt, the fortune badly strained by 2 decades of the Dowager Duchess's building projects. Her London seasons, her particular gift for spending faster than an estate the size of Rothbury, could reasonably replace it. Alistair had inherited the title at 8 and 20 and the debt alongside it, and he had married Harriet Colston, daughter of a modest baronet, for reasons he told himself at the time were sentiment and discovered only slowly, over 3 years, were considerably more practical than that. Her dowry, though unremarkable by the standards of the ton, came with something his mother's extravagance never had, a marriage settlement drafted with unusual care by Harriet's own father, that placed a portion of her income under her sole management as trustee, untouchable by her husband's creditors, and it was that portion, quietly and without ever once being asked for thanks, that had been covering the estate's shortfall for 3 years running. Harriet managed it herself. She managed a great deal herself. She kept the household accounts in a hand so clear that the estate's own steward, Mr. Pargeter, had come to rely on her corrections more than his own additions. She held the keys to every locked room at Rothbury Park on a chatelaine at her waist, a habit her own mother had taught her, and she used them daily to unlock still rooms and linen presses and the estate office itself, where she reconciled, every quarter, the gap between what the land produced and what the Dowager Duchess spent, and quietly closed it from her own trust, and told no one. Because Alistair had never once asked how the gap was closed, and she had, in 3 years, stopped expecting him to. She left on a Tuesday in April, before the household was fully awake, with 1 trunk, her own maid, and the chatelaine of keys laid neatly on the desk in the estate office, where anyone might find it. The note she left Alistair was 4 lines, and it said only that she had gone to her father's cottage at Ashenden, that she required no pursuit and no apology delivered by letter, and that if he wished to understand what she had carried these 3 years, he had only to open the estate ledger she had left beside the keys. He did not open it for a fortnight, because he assumed, in the particular way of men who have never once had to manage without something, that she would return within the week once her temper cooled, and he did not trouble to examine what her absence might actually cost until the cost arrived on its own account. It arrived first as small confusions. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldis, came to him in the 2nd week with a question about the linen accounts that Harriet had always answered without needing to consult a book, and Alistair, having no notion where the relevant ledger even lived, sent her to Mr. Pargeter, who had no notion either, because that particular reckoning had lived entirely inside Harriet's own careful head. It arrived next as larger confusions. The quarterly rents came in at the end of April, and Mr. Pargeter brought the figures to the Duke with visible unease, because the shortfall against the estate's running expenses, a shortfall that had existed every quarter for 3 years and had simply never once reached Alistair's own desk, now stood exposed at £420, with no explanation anywhere in the books for how it had been covered in the 12 quarters preceding. Her Grace managed this reconciliation personally, Your Grace, Pargeter said, with the careful discomfort of a man delivering news he did not fully understand himself. I confess I never asked how. I assumed some economy on her part. I did not think it my place to inquire. Alistair Rowe sat in his own estate office with 3 years of quietly balanced accounts laid open before him, and began, for the first time, to understand the shape of what he had lost. Before that understanding finished arriving, and it would take the better part of a season to arrive in full, the Dowager Duchess made her own feelings on the matter perfectly clear, and did so within days of Harriet's departure in the drawing room to anyone who would listen. "I do not know why you look so stricken," she told her son. "The girl was never suited to this house. I dare say the estate will run a good deal more smoothly without a baronet's daughter fussing over the linen presses as though she were still a farmer's wife." "The estate is not running smoothly, mother. The estate is £400 short this quarter alone, and I cannot find one soul in this house who can tell me how the shortfall was covered before." The Dowager Duchess did not answer that directly, because she did not, in truth, know the answer either, having never once considered it her business to ask how her own extravagances were quietly absorbed each year, only that they always somehow were. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, for what comes next is the part that changes everything. A duke discovering, quarter by quarter, exactly how much of his own life had been carried by hands he had never once thought to thank. May brought the first public evidence. Rothbury Park had, for 3 years, hosted the county's spring assembly in its own long gallery, an event Harriet had organized down to the last detail. The musicians engaged, the suppers ordered. The guest list balanced between rank and genuine friendship in a way that had made Rothbury's assemblies the most sought-after invitation in the county, precisely because Harriet had never once used them merely to display consequence. Without her, the assembly nearly did not happen at all. The Dowager Duchess attempting to organize it herself in her daughter-in-law's absence. Engaged musicians a full week too late to secure the county's preferred quartet, ordered a supper menu that repeated 3 dishes served at the previous year's event, and seated 2 families at adjoining tables whose long-standing quarrel over a boundary dispute Harriet had, for 3 years, quietly and invisibly kept separated. Alistair, standing near the doors watching his own long gallery descend into chaos, found himself remembering, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, how effortless Harriet had always made this look, how she moved through a crowded room reading tensions he had never once noticed existed, diffusing them with a well-timed introduction or a change of seating before they ever reached the surface. He had thought, in his idleness, that there was simply nothing to manage. He understood now that there had been a great deal to manage, constantly, and that she had managed all of it so well he had mistaken her skill for the room's natural calm. The evening ended in a shouting match between the Fentons and the Ardsleys that half the county was still discussing a month later, and Lady Fenton, cornering Alistair near the punch table, said what half the room was already thinking. "Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but Rothbury has not felt like Rothbury this evening. The Duchess had a gift for this that I confess none of us properly appreciated until it was gone." Alistair excused himself from his own assembly within the hour and rode, in the dark, the 11 miles to Ashenden, arriving at his wife's cottage past midnight with no plan beyond the plain need to see her. Harriet answered the door herself, in a wrapper, candle in hand, and did not look surprised to see him, which unsettled him more than anger would have. The candlelight caught the loose fall of her hair, unpinned for the night, and Alistair found himself, absurdly, unable to look away from the particular way a single strand curled against her throat, a small, ordinary thing he had walked past 1,000 mornings at Rothbury without once truly seeing, the way he had walked past the sound of the chatelaine at her waist, the set of her shoulders over a ledger, all of it. He stood on her father's doorstep at midnight and understood, with a force that startled him, that he wanted very badly to close the 2 feet of distance between them and had no earthly right to. "You should not have ridden out at this hour," she said. "I could not stay away another night. Harriet, the estate is falling apart without you. The tenants are asking questions Pargata cannot answer. My mother cannot organize a supper menu, let alone a household. I do not know how to run my own house." "No," Harriet said, "you do not. You never have. I have run it for 3 years, Alistair, and you allowed yourself never to notice, because it was easier to enjoy a well-run house than to ask what the running of it cost the person doing it. am asking now. You are asking because it is inconvenient that I stopped, not because you finally see me. There is a difference, and I have had 3 weeks alone in this cottage to understand it clearly for the first time in my marriage. Her voice did not rise, but it did not soften either. Go home, Your Grace. Sort out your supper menus. I find I am not yet ready to be your solution to a problem you have only just noticed exists. He did not step forward, though every part of him wanted to, because he understood. Even in that moment, that closing the distance now would be for his own comfort and not for hers, and that the one thing he owed her, after 3 years of taking without noticing, was the discipline to wait until she asked. Harriet, his voice had gone rough. May I at least know that you are well? That is all I will ask tonight. I am well, Alistair. I am, for the first time in longer than I can properly say, entirely my own. She held the candle a moment longer, close enough that he could see the fine tiredness at the corners of her eyes, and neither of them moved for several long seconds, the night air cool between them. Then she stepped back, deliberately, and the distance he had not dared to close on his own closed itself instead, from her side, in the only direction it could go that night. She closed the door, gently, and Alistair stood on the step of a cottage in the dark for a long moment before he rode home, and the 11 miles back gave him a great deal of time to sit with exactly how thoroughly he had earned that door being closed. June brought the Dowager Duchess's own reckoning, though it did not arrive as remorse. Faced with an estate visibly foundering and a son visibly wretched, she concluded, in the manner of a woman who had spent her whole life solving problems by the application of rank rather than reflection, that the solution was not her daughter-in-law's return, but her replacement. She began, quietly at first, and then with increasing openness, to correspond with the family of Miss Cordelia Hartwell, a considerable heiress newly out, whose £40,000 would clear the Rothbury debt entirely, and whose mother, the Dowager was gratified to find, was every bit as ambitious for the connection as she herself was. She arranged, without consulting her son at all, for the Hartwell family to be invited to Rothbury Park for a fortnight in July, and informed Alistair of the arrangement only once the invitation had already been accepted. You are still legally married to Harriet Colston, Alistair said, staring at his mother with an expression she had genuinely never seen on his face before. There is no possible purpose to this visit beyond humiliating my wife in absentia and myself in person. Your wife has abandoned this house and this family, Alistair. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because someone in this family must think practically, and it has never once, in 31 years, been you. The Dowager Duchess's composure did not crack. Miss Hartwell's fortune would resolve every difficulty this estate presently faces. You need only be civil to her for a fortnight while the matter is properly explored. I will be civil to her because courtesy costs nothing. I will not be exploring anything, Mother, and I would ask you to write to the Hartwells today and explain, in whatever terms spare everyone the greatest embarrassment, that the visit was arranged in error. The Dowager Duchess did not write that letter. The Hartwells arrived as scheduled in the 2nd week of July, and it was at the dinner given to welcome them, attended, by cruel coincidence, by half the same guests who had heard the Dowager Duchess's original remark about Harriet 3 months before, that the second and sharper blow of that season landed. A letter arrived for Alistair during the soup course, delivered by a groom who had ridden hard from Ashenden, and its contents, once he had read them at the table in front of 11 guests, including Miss Hartwell and her ambitious mother, drained the colour entirely from his face. Harriet's trust, drafted so carefully by her own father years before, contained a clause neither Alistair nor, it transpired, the Dowager Duchess had ever troubled to read, that the trustee's income, though settled upon the marriage, reverted entirely to Harriet's own independent control, revocable from supporting her husband's household at her sole discretion, should she at any time establish a separate residence for a period exceeding 3 months. The 3 months had, that week, expired. The quarterly transfer that had for 3 years quietly closed Rothbury's shortfall would not come again, and the estate's creditors, several of whom had been managed for years on the strength of that reliable quarterly figure, would need to be answered directly and without it. She has finally shown her true character, the Dowager Duchess said into the stricken silence of the dinner table, reaching, as she always did, for blame rather than reflection. A wife who withdraws support from her own husband's house. A wife, Alistair said, standing, his voice carrying the length of the table exactly as his mother's had 3 months before, who has supported this house alone for 3 years while being told, at this very table, that she had nothing to offer it. I will not sit here and let you call her withdrawal cruelty when the cruelty began with you, Mother, in this room, in April, and has not once in 3 months been answered by so much as an apology. The table had gone entirely silent, 11 guests watching a duke do the one thing none of them had ever seen him do in 3 years of dinners under his mother's rule. Every quarter for 3 years, Harriet Rowe closed a gap in this estate's accounts from her own income, without asking me for gratitude and without once telling me the sum, because she understood, better than I ever troubled to, that I would rather be comfortable than informed. I let her carry it in silence because silence was convenient for me. That silence has now ended, and I find I am glad of it, whatever it costs this house to learn the truth in front of company. He looked at Miss Hartwell, who had the grace to appear thoroughly uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. Miss Hartwell, I am sorry you have been made a pawn in a scheme you did not ask for and do not deserve. You will find, I hope, a match that values you for considerably more than your father's £40,000. I am going to Ashenden tonight, and I do not expect to return to this table until I have said, to my wife, everything I ought to have said 3 years ago. Harriet was in the small garden of the Ashenden cottage in the last of the July light when Alistair arrived, and this time he did not ride up in a panic at midnight, but came in the ordinary evening, on foot from where he had left his horse at the gate, and stopped at a proper distance, and did not ask to come nearer until she said he might. I have read the trust clause, he said. I did not know it existed. I am ashamed to say I have never in 3 years read the document that has in fact been quietly keeping my own house from ruin. No, Harriet agreed. You have not. I have also learned this past season in the plainest possible terms exactly what you carried and exactly how invisible I allowed that carrying to remain. The assembly, the accounts, my mother's cruelty, which I excused every single time rather than once ever, standing between the two of you the way a husband ought to. He drew a breath. I do not come tonight to ask you to resume the arrangement, Harriet. I do not want my house run by a woman I have failed to see. I want to actually see you, and I do not yet know if I have earned the right to ask for that. But I am asking anyway. You brought an heiress to dinner 3 days ago. My mother brought an heiress to dinner. I told the whole table, in front of her and her mother both, that I was riding here tonight to say everything I ought to have said years ago. And that is the truth, whatever else my mother arranges without my consent. He held her gaze. I have spent 3 years accepting the comfort you built without once asking what it cost you to build it. I am not asking you to forgive that in an evening. I am telling you I finally understand it, which I did not before, and I would like the chance to be worth the trust you once placed in a man who did not deserve it. Harriet Rowe stood in her father's garden in the last of the light and looked at her husband for a long moment. My father built that clause into the settlement, she said, because he suspected, better than I did at 21, that a woman's worth in a great house is measured by what she is willing to quietly absorb, and he wanted me to have a door I could close if the absorbing ever became more than I could bear. I did not think I would ever need it. I needed it in April. Her voice was unsteady now, the composure of 3 months finally cracking. I do not want to go back to being invisible, Alistair. I do not want to manage a house from the shadows while your mother tells dinner tables I have nothing to offer it. If I come back, it will be as your wife, seen, in the light, with my name on the account books instead of buried inside them. Then that is exactly how you will come back, Alistair said. I will have Pargata draw up whatever arrangement makes your management of that estate a matter of record and credit rather than invisible sacrifice, and I will stand beside you the next time my mother opens her mouth at a dinner table, and I will not wait until the corridor after to say so. Harriet reached into the small basket at her feet, where she had set it down upon coming out into the garden that evening, and drew out the chatelaine of keys, cleaned and polished, that she had left behind on the estate office desk in April. I brought this with me from the cottage tonight, she said, though I could not have told you, an hour ago, why. I think I understand now. I did not want it back as a burden, Alistair. I wanted to know, before I ever touched it again, that it would mean something different in your hands than it did in mine 3 months ago. It will mean exactly what it should have meant from the first day I put a ring on your finger, he said, that the house is as much yours as it is mine, in the open, on the record, for anyone to see. She crossed the small garden herself, and the narrator sets that down plainly, for there was not a thing in the world compelling her to do it. What passed between them then was brief, and it was the first kiss either of them had known in 3 difficult months, and what broke open in her was not longing, but the plain unbearable relief of being chosen, finally, in daylight, by a man who had learned at last what her quiet had cost. The Dowager Duchess did not accept any of it gracefully. She wrote to relations across 3 counties characterizing Harriet's return as a mercenary reconciliation and her son's conduct as weakness, and she continued, for some months, to attempt small cruelties at the dinner table out of old habit. Until the evening in September when she remarked, in Harriet's hearing, that some wives knew their place better than others. Alistair set down his own glass before Harriet could set down hers. Mother, you will apologize to my wife, at this table, tonight, or you will take your dinners in the Dower House from this evening forward. I have given you 31 years of silence on this exact subject, and I find I have entirely run out of it. The Dowager Duchess did not apologize that night. She sat rigid at the table for a long moment, weighing, Harriet suspected, the cost of pride against the cost of a lonely dinner table, and in the end said nothing at all, which Alistair took, correctly, as her answer. She removed to the Dower House within the month, by her own choice rather than eviction, and the 2 households settled, over the following years, into a distant and largely peaceable coexistence that never once again required Harriet to sit through a dinner where her worth was weighed aloud. Mr. Pargata, for his part, told anyone who asked that he had never in his life been so relieved to see a name added to a set of account books, and that he intended to retire a happier man for having spent his final working years answering to 2 clear-eyed employers instead of 1 distracted one. The reconciliation was not, the narrator will note plainly, a single grand gesture that mended 3 years of quiet neglect overnight. It was built, through that autumn and winter, out of 100 small corrections, Alistair sitting beside her now at the estate office desk 2 mornings a week, learning to read the figures she had once carried alone, a standing rule, enforced without exception. That any remark made against her at his own table would be answered by him, immediately, in the same room, rather than apologized for privately afterward. Small notes left for her some mornings, in his own hand, saying nothing more than that he had noticed some particular kindness of hers the day before, and wished her to know it had not gone unseen. Harriet's name went onto the estate accounts as co-signatory that autumn, her chatelaine of keys returned to her waist not as a servant's burden, but as a mark of authority Pargata himself insisted upon recording properly in the estate ledger. The Rothbury Spring Assembly resumed the following year, organized once more with her particular gift for balancing rank against genuine friendship. And Lady Fenton, greeting her at the door, said only that the county had missed her rather more than it had ever thought to say aloud while she was present. Even the Fentons and the Ardsleys, seated a careful distance apart once more, remarked to one another over the punch that the evening finally felt like Rothbury again, without ever quite understanding why the previous year's assembly had felt so wrong. On a bright afternoon the following spring, Alistair found his wife in the estate office going over the quarterly accounts, her own hand steady beside Pargeter's, both signatures now required where once only silent absorption had been. "You never did tell me," he said, "why you left the keys on the desk instead of taking them with you. I have thought about it a great deal this past year. It would have been the simpler thing, surely, to carry them off to Ashenden and leave this house with nothing at all to unlock. I thought about that too, that morning. I stood in the estate office a long while deciding it." Harriet set down her pen. "But I did not want to punish the house, Alistair. I wanted you to see, plainly, on the desk where you could not miss it, exactly what had been managing your life without your noticing. A woman who truly meant to wound you would have taken the keys and left the ledgers in chaos. I left them in perfect order because I was not trying to ruin you. I was trying, in the only language I still believed you would understand, to be seen. Because I did not leave to punish you, Alistair. I left because I had stopped believing my staying meant anything to anyone in this house, and a woman who believes that has nothing left to unlock." She looked up at him, the ledger open between them, both their names upon it now. "I find I believe otherwise these days." He came and stood behind her chair, his hand resting light on her shoulder, and looked down at the accounts they now kept together, in the open, where anyone in the county might see exactly what she had always been worth. The chatelaine hung at her waist, catching the afternoon light, the same set of keys that had once unlocked every room in the house without ever once being asked to unlock the one thing that mattered most, which was her husband's attention. "You have everything to offer this house," he said quietly. "It very nearly fell apart the moment you stopped believing anyone here understood that." "Then make certain," Harriet said, "that no one in this house ever forgets it again." He never did. And in the years that followed, whenever a new bride came into the county uncertain of her welcome, or a young wife sat too quietly through a cruel remark at somebody else's table, it was the Duchess of Rothbury, more often than not, who crossed the room first to sit beside her. Not because she required thanks for it, but because she remembered, better than most, exactly how much a single unanswered cruelty could cost a woman who had already decided to stop arguing and simply, quietly, go.